Hello all, welcome back to the Environmental Economics series. My brother and I are in the heavenly hills of eastern Kentucky here in the Red River Gorge. We're looking for a very special few salamanders and discussing conservation issues that are specific to eastern Kentucky in the coal industry and mine reclamation with some of the kind folks from Eastern Kentucky University and a few researchers from there. Coal still produces a huge share of American electricity, although in recent decades competition from cheaper natural gas from hydraulic fracturing has slowly decreased coal's competitiveness and its market share in generating America's electric power, leaving many mines to close. Coal mining, while it remains an economically necessary industry, particularly here in the Central Appalachians, has many side effects on the environment, including the difficulty of disposing of tailings, or the byproducts of mining, and the practice of what they call mountaintop removal mining.
Mountaintop removal mining is the practice of blowing off the top of a mountain with explosives to reduce expenses to get to coal deposits. As the normal practices of boring tunnels through the mountain and supports is very expensive. The practice emerged in the mid-20th century and has been used to keep bituminous coal mining, cost-competitive natural gas, and other forms of energy that require less extraction cost. Although the effects on wildlife and quality of life in the places where this practice has been used can be substantial. Often, the debris from mountaintop removal or tailings is dumped in nearby ravines and hollers, and the downstream runoff can pollute river systems and streams for miles, including drinking water supplies, while the tailings can also bury what was previously forest land. Today, coal continues to supply about 20% of U.S. power generation, although this is down from well over half only 3 decades ago, as hydraulic fracturing has made natural gas a cheaper alternative while emitting less CO2 per unit of energy generated as power producers anticipate the possibility of a future carbon tax. This decline in coal's market share of U.S. electricity generation has upended the economy in much of Kentucky, southern Ohio, and West Virginia. But mountaintop removal mining, while declining, is still in use, with the Army Corps of Engineers generally being more lenient with permits under GOP administrations and more restrictive when Democrats hold the White House. Whether the practice is right, wrong, or somewhere in between, we leave to the viewer. But today, we're going to a preserve in rural southeast Kentucky, in the heart of coal country, to see if we can locate some unique Kentucky fauna that coexists along the nation's coal industry, and talk to the folks who study them.
Now we're going to see a few critters that live exclusively in rock crevices within the hollers that in areas that have abundant bituminous coal deposits might be covered with slag or tailings due to the practice of mountaintop removal mining. Although the laws on this differ state by state, both Kentucky and Tennessee have designated this newly described salamander that we're going to try to see this evening as critically imperiled due to the close proximity of its range to surface coal mining and because of the species' overall scarcity and the lack of known sites for the species, although these designations carry various levels of legal protection in the states.
Kentucky in the morning, trimmed in green and blue. Kentucky in the morning, I was only passing through.
That was a machine that was offloading bituminous coal from a coal depot here in southeast Kentucky. Just a little footage that might be pertinent to both the environmental economics video and this one, just the scenery and what's going on around here near Hazard, Kentucky. Well, we're here at the Lily Cornet Woods Preserve in southeastern Kentucky with Dr. Stephen Richter of Eastern Kentucky University to talk about a few conservation issues and the salamander that I alluded to earlier in this video. So first off, Stephen, could you just walk us through a little bit about this new species? Was it completely new? Was it split from another species? And kind of just what are its habitat?
Sure, yeah. So the original, there's a complex now, it's known to be different species. Originally was Plethodon whirly salamander that occurred from New York down into West Virginia and Kentucky. And there's variation across that range that in morphology that indicates it might be there might be separate species there. And so some recent work by Zach Felix and colleagues found morphological and genetic data to support 5 different species in that. And so we ended up in Kentucky here with Plethodon pollyi, which was named after a famous herpetologist, Tom Pauly, who retired from Marshall University and studied whirly salamanders for many decades.
Okay. Very interesting. And so when you say there are morphological differences, what about this salamander's appearance separates it from the other members of Plethodon whirlyi, or the old whirly salamander?
Some of them are fairly cryptic in that you have to count grooves, costal grooves they're called, that are along their body sides. But for our species here, pollyi, the yellow spots are diagnostic. There's some other characteristics that we don't really need to get into because you can use the spots.
The spots just give it away. Yeah, I find that interesting. Growing up in the Midwest, we find a lot of Ambystoma mole salamanders when my brother and I were growing up. And the spotted salamander is the only other salamander in North America I know of that has 2 rows of straight yellow spots. So do you think there's some sort of convergent evolution happening? Do we know what the advantage of that morphology is, the 2 rows of yellow spots?
There could be. I don't know that anyone's really looked at that. And their spotted salamanders especially it's not exactly rows, and you can actually identify individual spotted salamanders by their spot pattern and how they're arranged. Pollyi, is similarly not exactly in rows, but there have been studies that have shown that spotted salamanders have a noxious skin secretion and that those yellow spots are characteristic. They're honest signals of that, and a lot of animals have bright coloration when they're noxious or poisonous.
Right.
And so most Plethodon, the genus of pollyi, most species of Plethodon, which is the most species in the world of salamanders, have a noxious skin secretion, but they don't all have the spots. So that's where it's sort of hard to tell. And even sister species closely related to yellow spotted woodland salamanders don't have the yellow spots that also have the noxious skin secretion. So it's kind of hard to tell if there's some convergent evolution there or not.
Okay, or if it's just random and the same sort of pattern evolved twice.
Right, yeah, and it could be that they're just both noxious and there's an honest signal there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as far as time of day when these salamanders are out and about, are they diurnal, crepuscular, nocturnal?
They are mostly nocturnal, although they are so cryptic and difficult to detect when they're at a site that it's hard to know that for sure. My graduate student found one in the woods probably 200 meters from a rock face, just in the leaf litter during the day, but it was against the soil, plenty of moisture. The rock face here, Lily Cornet Woods, is fairly dry unless it's rained recently or it's just relative humidity's high. And so even though we know they're there, we could go there and 1 out of 20 times we won't find them. They're just very cryptic.
Yeah. Interesting. And so where do they go when it's either day or it's really dry? I know you said we'll try to find one tonight, but it hasn't rained in a bit, so we may not. But where would they go in a time like this? Just kind of deeper into that sandstone?
In shale.
Shale.
Yeah,
Okay.
for here. And they do occur on sandstone at some sites. I haven't been to any where there's sandstone, but here it's really because shale doesn't hold moisture as well as sandstone. It's not porous. It's much finer, and so it takes a lot of moisture and rain for it to stay moist. And then if it's long enough and it dries out, then it gets dusty and not good for salamanders. So they'll spend time back in crevices and in leaf litter, finding moisture. Yeah.
Okay. Well, now that we've talked about some of the specifics around the salamander, we'll probably bring it back general, and I'm going to throw it over to my brother just to ask a few questions. So Nolan, take it away.
So what do preserves like this one play in conserving small fauna, such as salamanders, and in general, just fauna? And where can people donate to organizations like this or others that operate in their state to conserve unique habitats?
Sure, yeah. So our site is an old growth forest, and so it has lots of unique characteristics about it that Plethodon poly doesn't require, but certainly benefit and provide the habitat it needs. It's a stronghold for it. They are found in some disturbed areas as well. And so although there are lots of great organizations out there, yes, I can recommend Kentucky Natural Lands Trust as a broader one that's Kentucky based, and they're working toward preserving the Pine Mountain corridor from Tennessee up to West Virginia and beyond as a climate mitigation corridor for organisms broadly. And so they've worked with landowners and state agencies to purchase properties and manage it appropriately with state nature preserves and other groups. Also, I'll put in a plug for the Division of Natural Areas at Eastern Kentucky University. If you go to naturalareas.eku.edu, not only do we get students involved in managing the land, but also in educating the public about climate change and water quality and the importance of forested areas and things like that. So we do a lot of work with donor funds, hiring students to educate the public.
Another question would be, could you briefly discuss some of the challenges of conservation areas with coal deposits and mine reclamation specifically for your work on the species?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a kind of a tricky subject with coal because it was very important historically, economically, culturally, and continues to be. And so we know that a lot of the properties surrounding ours, including some of the state lands now, have been impacted by coal mining, and so now working toward how do we recover those more appropriately than how they have been in the past. Wally Smith, who's a professor over at University of Virginia Wise, studying green salamanders, has found them have populations on abandoned coal mines, not abandoned, restored coal mines. And so we know that if we're able to restore them and then start protecting those areas as they regrow, that they can become suitable habitat again.
Interesting. One question that comes to my mind as we discuss that, you know, the coal mining and the reclamation and things like that, is, you know, when I was in college, my thesis was about timber rotations in the South, and like what would the optimum timber rotation be from an economic perspective. And one of the things I bumped into is a lot of those logging corporations that you would think are just profit maximizing tend to conserve for a lot of the things that are on their land and cooperate pretty closely with state agencies. So is that generally kind of the, I'm struggling for the word here, but generally the pattern with the coal mining industry is as well, that like once the mining in the area is done, reclamation usually happens and things of that nature?
Well, no, not as much, because the laws for reclamation were basically put the topography back. So it often meant highly compacted, no soil, and then it became overrun with invasive grasses and invasive trees like princess tree, tree of heaven, autumn olive, shrub. And so it is very difficult to restore them correctly, but there are groups out there that are restoring them to become more suitable. But it does take a lot of money and effort to do that.
Yeah.
You mentioned the timber, that sustainable approach to timber harvest, where it's not just the ecological trap of how much money can we make right now with the trees that are here, but thinking more long term of what are the economic benefits of harvesting smaller amounts of trees or smaller areas, and sort of rotating that around where you maximize the economics over the long term versus making a lot of money up front. That's something that we need to educate the public more about, and private landowners in eastern Kentucky. There's a lot of timber harvesting that's happening now.
Yeah. I was a little off topic, but since we're on timber harvesting, when you say need to educate, would one of the worries be, you clear cut and then it's pretty sloped terrain around here from the drive-in, and that Nolan got a pretty good show of that driving us in the last 30 miles, that you just get a mudslide and now you can't grow another crop of trees on there. Is that?
Yeah, the soil erosion, but also the invasive species.
Yeah.
So kudzu and autumn olive and Japanese knotweed and Emmer honeysuckle, all these species that will come in, they're great pioneer species, so they'll colonize the habitat, and so that the trees that are worth the money that can be harvested in later years won't do as well or may not grow at all. And so trying to, and it's difficult again, it's an economic situation where money's needed now, but how do you maximize what can be gained now with knowing that you're leaving something for the next generation?
Yeah. And that's probably the heart of conservation right there, is how do you leave things for the next generation?
Right.
You know, thinking beyond ourselves. Well, Nolan, did you have any additional follow-up questions?
I do not.
Okay, well, I like to thank Dr. Richter, Stephen, for his time, and hopefully there will be a little bit more of this video later tonight as we look at some of the salamanders out on the shale here in eastern Kentucky, whether those are yellow-spotted woodland salamanders, or you were telling me the green salamander, which lives alongside the yellow-spotted woodland. So, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Welcome. Great. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah. So we're at the base of a shale, otherwise known as mudstone outcrop, that's home to the yellow-spotted woodland salamander. As you notice, little bits of it crack off very easily. It's shale. Dr. Richter tells us that because it hasn't rained in about a week, this rock is drier than it normally is. And unlike sandstone, which we'll be in later tonight to look for green salamanders, shale does not hold on to moisture as much, and therefore salamanders are less likely to be out on the surface when it has not rained in a while. It's drier, whereas the sandstone is more porous and holds on to more moisture, as you told us earlier. So, very interesting habitat. Like if you just look around me, if any of you have ever looked for green salamanders, this doesn't look like the kind of rock where you find green salamanders, even though we're very close to one that has them. And that's because it is a different rock. It's shale. It's not sandstone. So it's very, very interesting that minor differences in microhabitat make big differences in animal behavior. So this is a green salamander, Anites aeneas, from Kentucky. As we were talking about earlier, the sandstone holds on to more moisture than the shale. And I actually just saw either a Cumberland Plateau or a northern slimy down that way. My brother saw a suspicious looking salamander over here, maybe a green, maybe a poly-eye. But just in maybe 15 minutes of searching this sandstone, even though it hasn't rained in a while, we've seen 3 salamanders. So pretty cool. There's talk that this species may be split up into the northern green, which this would be, basically from the Kentucky-Tennessee border north, the southern along the Cumberland Plateau, and then 2 species in North Carolina, the Hickory Nut Gorge green salamander, and then the other one that lives on the remainder of the Blue Ridge Escarpment in like Transylvania and Rutherford and Henderson County. But beautiful, beautiful little critter. I never get tired of seeing greens. Seen him a few times before, but cool find, and just as the sun is setting here in Kentucky. Okay, so we're out here in Kentucky, and we did see a green salamander earlier in the sandstone. We've been doing some creek herping that'll show up on the main herping video for this trip. But I wanted to just throw this in, that this creek is, this little shale stream we're in, upriver, is unbelievably productive for Desmognathus. We've seen probably 20 or 30 just in a few yards, some 2 lines, and now this red salamander. And all these salamanders being in abundance here is indicative of good water quality. And so this, again, just goes to show like how important it is to preserve areas like this. And Dr. Richter was telling us that there are other streams around here that are on reclaimed coal mine areas, or areas that used to be coal mines but have not really been reclaimed, and they tend to wash out very easily during storms. Maybe these cover objects wouldn't be here because they're washed downstream, or they're toxic pollutants or whatever, and we would not see this level of biodiversity in the streams. So just kind of an interesting illustration of we're on this preserve. The stream is flowing out of old growth habitat, and we're seeing this unbelievable array of biodiversity. It's just something interesting that Stephen pointed out here, is that here we're looking at the line fork of the North Fork of the Kentucky River, and here there's a creek flowing into it. And you notice right where they meet, there's this big buildup of sediment. And then the rocks right here are tinted like that ironish color that really stands out from the rest of the rocks. And that's because there used to be an active mine up that way. So this stream here is not nearly as healthy as the one we were just looking for salamanders in large part, you know, due to runoff from the mine and from the mine tailings, as we were talking about. So just like a real life example of what we were discussing in the intro to this video. We are out here still with Dr. Stephen Richter, and what do we think our chances were tonight on these?
Infinitesimally small.
Infinitesimally small. That might also describe the salamander we're looking at, which is a yellow-spotted woodland baby here, Plethodon pollyi, formerly considered a whirly salamander here in southeast Kentucky. And we're here on shale, which again was drier than the sandstone, but apparently just moist enough to bring 3 of these out. An adult that I just filmed for our herping video, this baby, and another adult that's still up on that rock face. An amazing species, unique to southeast Kentucky and Tennessee, and and a little bit of West Virginia. Very lucky tonight to be able to see one, and just reinforces how special places like this are, how important it is to conserve them, and you know, people place real value on experiences like this and on seeing animals like this, and you know, various organizations like those that Dr. Richter cited earlier, or the Nature Conservancy, places like that, they pool the value that people put on places like this and express it in a purchase price so that this kind of stuff, you know, is available to the next generation. So just unbelievably cool. And I can't thank Dr. Richter enough and Eastern Kentucky University for letting us come out and see this protected species. It's been an honor, and I hope you've had some fun too.
Absolutely. I'm out of the office.
Yeah, it's always a good thing. But yeah, what a night. What a night. And folks, look into places in your neck of the woods that do this kind of work and conserve things like this that are rare and that need protecting. Here is the yellow-spotted woodland salamander going back into his native rock crevice habitat. There he goes.